The title of this presentation, The Divine Experiment, was suggested to me by these lines that occurred near the end of Book 1, Canto 3 of Savitri, the Yoga of the King, the Yoga of the Soul's Release. Once only registering the heavy tread of a blind power on human littleness, life now became a sure approach to God, existence a divine experiment, and cosmos the soul's opportunity. Earlier in the same canto, we also find these lines: in every hour loosed from the quiver of time, there rose a song of new discovery, a bow twang's hum of young experiment. The experimental aspect of the yoga, the fact that it's an attempt to do something new, an adventure into the unknown, is part of the reason why it can be interesting to compare Savitri with the diary of Sri Aurobindo's spiritual practice, which he called the Record of Yoga. It is true that most of the passages depicting Ashwapati's yoga were written after Sri Aurobindo had stopped keeping the diary. But as we will see, Ashwapati's experiences correspond closely with many of those that Sri Aurobindo had previously documented day by day in a very different format in his diary, even before he started to write Savitri. Let us turn now to a typical entry in the record. It will soon become clear that although the record is referred to as a diary because of its chronological format, it is quite unlike any other diary. For one thing, there are several hundred pages of the diary where the words I, me, my do not occur. Part of the experimental method of science, which Sri Aurobindo was applying in a certain way to psychological development and spiritual experience, is that failures are recorded in the same detail and with the same impartiality and rectitude as successes. So we read in the last entry of 1912, "This day closes the year 1912. At present, there is no sign of any rapid progress or of really great results. All is petty, hampered, and limited. Continuity in the higher states seems as yet impossible, and from accomplishment there is always a relapse into a condition of partial asiddhi." Different as this might seem from the triumphant tone of much of the yoga of the king, in fact, Ashwapati experiences similar relapses. As we see in these lines, only a while at first, these heavenlier states, these large, wide poised upliftings could endure. Compare that with the phrase from the entry in the Record of Yoga, which I just read: continuity in the higher states seems as yet impossible. Of course, this was only a certain stage, but the source of the difficulty is also similarly identified in both texts as being a kind of gravitation. The passage in Savitri continues: "An old pull of subconscious cords renews. It draws the unwilling spirit from the heights, or a dull gravitation drags us down to the blind, driven inertia of our base." Likewise, we read in the Record of Yoga, "The main defect lies now in the downward gravitation, which prevents the thought from being of the highest elevation possible." But to come back to the entry of December 31st, 1912, it continues and concludes in a more positive vein. "On the other hand, the theory of the yoga has been proved. The perfectibility of the human being, trikal drishti, power, the play of the divine force in the individual, the existence of the other worlds, even the possibility of the physical Siddhis, are established facts. It has been seen that in repose, in nivritti, in udasinata, perfect peace and ananda are possible. But the thing the yoga has set out to establish is the perfect harmony of nivritti and pravritti, consummating in the full and vehement flow of the pravritti. By the fulfillment or failure of this harmony, the yoga stands or falls. This is a key statement about Sri Aurobindo's yoga, the harmonization of passive and active, negative and positive, static and dynamic realizations, called here nivritti and pravritti, constitutes the integrality of the Integralyoga. This integrality is summed up in what Sri Aurobindo called the Sapta Chatushtaya, consisting of 7 terms, each further subdivided into 4. The 7 terms are Samatha, Shakti, Vijnana, Sharira, Karma, Brahma, and Siddhi. A pyramid arrangement of the Sapta Chatushtaya brings out the underlying logic of the system, as I will show in a moment. But before I do that, the whole of the yoga of self-perfection is encapsulated in 3 extraordinary lines in the first paragraph of the Yoga of the King. A static oneness and dynamic power descend in him, the integral Godhead's seals, his soul and body take that splendid stamp. Now let me juxtapose this with the pyramid arrangement of the Sapta Chatushtaya, and one can see the static oneness consisting of the realizations of Samatha and Brahma, the first and 6th Chatushtayas, as the foundation. A static oneness and dynamic power. The second level on that basis is the dynamic realization of Shakti and Karma. The Siddhi of the integral Godhead depends on the union of the Vijnana and Sharira Chatushtayas, overcoming the division between soul and body. His soul and body take that splendid stamp. Now, in June 1916, Sri Aurobindo wrote a letter to the mother, who was then in Japan, which is one of his first explanations of the Sapta Chatushtaya, this system of the yoga of self-perfection, as he calls it in part 4 of the Synthesis of Yoga. There he wrote, referring to the Sapta Chatushtaya as a map. As I have long had the map of my advance sketched out before me, I am able to measure my progress at each step, and the particular losses are compensated for by the clear consciousness of the general advance that has been made. The final goal is far, but the progress made in the face of so constant and massive an opposition is the guarantee of its being gained in the end. Then Sri Aurobindo goes on to explain in his letter to the mother, to explain the Sapta Chatushtaya, without calling it that, but beginning with Samatha and the Brahma Chatushtaya, an absolute equality of the mind and heart, and a clear purity and calm strength in all the members of the being have long been the primary condition on which the power working in me has insisted. As they become firmer and more complete, the system is more able to hold consistently and vividly the settled perception of the One in all things and beings. When the unity has been well founded, the static half of our work is done, but the active half remains. It is then that in the one we must see the Master and his power. The Master using, directing, enjoying the power to his ends, not mine, with that which I call myself only as a center of his universal existence. When that has been done, then we may hope to found securely the play in us of his divine knowledge, governing the action of his divine power. The rest is the full opening up of the different planes of his world play and the subjection of matter and the body and the material world to the law of the higher heavens of the truth. So we have described here first Samatha and the realization of Brahman, then Shakti and Karma, and finally Vijnana, divine knowledge, and the body, the beginning of the transformation of the body and matter constituting the final Siddhi. To bring all this together, the pyramid presentation of the Sapta Chatushtaya, the 3 lines from Savitri and the letter to the mother explaining the Sapta Chatushtaya, you have the absolute equality and the settled perception of the one constituting the base of the pyramid. Then the second level consists of the dynamic power, Shakti and Karma. And then finally the Siddhi, depending on the divine knowledge and the subjection of matter and the body to the law of the truth. So this is an explanation of how the whole of Sri Aurobindo's yoga is encapsulated in these 3 lines in the very first paragraph of Book 1, Canto 3 of Savitri. Now, just to emphasize how important it is to understand and master the Sapta Chatushtaya if one hopes to have any understanding of the record of yoga, this is a typical entry in which Sri Aurobindo writes, "It is the replacement of the mental perceptions and impulses that is the work of the Vijnana Chatushtaya. It is because that work is not yet done that the first 2 Chatushtayas are open to shocks and disturbances through the disappointment of the faith. But the entire fulfillment of the 3rd implies the fulfillment of the 4th and 5th, and therefore necessarily of the 6th and 7th. So obviously in order to read this, one has to first know exactly what the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th Chatushtayas are. Therefore, it is an integral fulfillment that is being worked out, and this aim prevents the separate perfection of each Chatushtaya by itself without relation to the rest." Now let's come back to the yoga of the king and go on to the second section, which begins with these lines. "As so he grew into his larger self, humanity framed his movements less and less. A greater being saw a greater world." In the record of yoga we read, "The shadow of intellectual consideration and hesitation over the act or the thought, the shadow of intellectual determination of the act or thought, the shadow of reflection and judgment over it when accomplished, all these glints of the lower humanity have to be effaced. They must be utterly replaced by unchecked force in the act and pure sight in the vision." You remember the line, "Humanity framed his movements less and less," and here we read, "All these glints of the lower humanity must be effaced." The passage in Savitri continues, "A fearless will for knowledge, dared to erase the lines of safety reason draws that bar minds soar, souls dive into the infinite." Now, although these lines are concerned with knowledge, the minds soar and souls dive into the infinite, it begins with this line, a fearless will for knowledge dared to erase these lines of safety. And in order to see the relation between this and the Sapta Chatushtaya, we have to turn now to the Shakti Chatushtaya, because this fearless will for knowledge is related to one member of the Shakti Chatushtaya, which Sri Aurobindo explains in the Synthesis of Yoga in the chapter called Soul Force and the Fourfold Personality. And in his explanation of the Sapta Chatushtaya, he writes, introducing this Shakti Chatushtaya, this may be called the Siddhi of the temperament or nature in the lower system, in the internal triloka of mind, life, and body, manas, prana, annam. To put it from a higher standpoint, it is the Siddhi of the divine Shakti working in these three principles. And here we have the first example of a Chatushtaya, the four members of a Chatushtaya. Chatushtaya means a group of four things, four terms: Virya, Shakti, Chandi Bhava, Shraddha. The terminology varies a little bit later on. He changed Chandi Bhava to Devi Bhava or Devi Prakriti. But let's start with Virya, because this is the soul force that manifests through the fourfold personality of Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra, the Chaturvarnya. So Sri Aurobindo explains, by Virya is meant the fundamental Swabhava Shakti, or the energy of the divine temperament, expressing itself in the fourfold type of the Chaturvarnya. Every man has in himself all the four dharmas, but one predominates. The perfected man develops in himself all four capacities. Now the first is Brahma Tejas, and that has, again, four parts: Jnana Lipsa, Jnana Prakasho, Brahma Varchasyam Stairyam iti Brahma Teja. Sri Aurobindo wrote the formula out actually in Devanagari, but transliterated it himself, and I've just given the transliteration. He explains Jnana Lipsa under the heading Lipsa. The Purna Yogin accepts the Jnana Lipsa and, purifying it of desire, turns it into a divine reaching out towards Prakasha of knowledge. In other words, Jnana Lipsa is the will for knowledge. Kshatriya Tejas consists of Abhayam, Sahasam, Yasholipsa, Atma Shlaga. And Abhaya and Sahasa, which together constitute courage, consists of two different forms of courage. Abhayam is the passive freedom from fear, fearlessness, in other words, which with a bold calmness meets and receives every menace of danger and shock of misfortune. Sahasam is the active courage and daring, which shrinks from no enterprise, however difficult and perilous. So here we have the fearlessness and the daring in the first line of the three that I read a little while ago. A fearless will for knowledge dared. The fearlessness and the daring are the qualities of the Kshatriya. The will for knowledge is a quality of the Brahmana. So in one line we have three terms from the record of yoga, all packed together into this phrase. A fearless will for knowledge dared to erase the lines of safety, reason draws that bar, minds soar, souls dive into the infinite. Then the passage goes on, in hands sustained by a transfiguring might, he caught up lightly, like a giant's bow, left slumbering in a sealed and secret cave, the powers that sleep unused in man within. He made of miracle a normal act, and turned to a common part of divine works, magnificently natural at this height, efforts that would shatter the strength of mortal hearts. This is related to the qualities of Deha Shakti. The second member of the Shakti Chatushtaya was called Shakti and is explained in the Synthesis of Yoga in the chapter The Power of the Instruments. Sri Aurobindo explains it concisely. Shakti is that perfection of the different parts of the system which enables them to do their work freely and perfectly. It consists of Deha Shakti, Prana Shakti, Chitta Shakti, and Buddhi Shakti. And within Deha Shakti, it consists of Mahatva Bodho, Balashlagha, Laguta, Dharana Samarthyam, iti Deha Shakti. The best explanation of this is found in the synthesis in the chapter I mentioned. And in the body itself, there will be a presence of a greatness of sustaining force. You remember the words, in hands sustained by a transfiguring might. This is the greatness of sustaining force. It goes on, he caught up lightly. This is the laguta, the third attribute of Deha Shakti. First you have an abounding strength, energy, and presence of outgoing and managing force. Then a lightness, swiftness, and adaptability of the nervous and physical being. And finally, and most importantly, as Sri Aurobindo explains, the body must develop a perfect power to hold whatever force is brought into it by the spirit, and to contain its action without spilling and wasting it, or itself getting cracked. So we had the efforts that would shatter the strength of mortal hearts. He turned to a common part of divine works, efforts that would shatter the strength of mortal hearts. And this is the dharana samarthya, which Sri Aurobindo considered an essential attribute of the preparation of the body. This is not yet the transformation of the body, which comes in the fourth Chatushtaya, Shrira Chatushtaya, but under Shakti, which is the preliminary perfection of all of the parts of the being and the fourfold personality. This is an attribute. This is the preparation of the body that comes under the heading of Deha Shakti. Now we're going to come to the first reference in the passage which I'm reading from Savitri in the second section of the Yoga of the King. We're going to come to some of the terms that occur in the Vijnana Chatushtaya, which is perhaps the most important of the seven Chatushtayas in the sense that Sri Aurobindo's yoga is the supramental yoga and Vijnana is the supermind. So under Vijnana, there are again four terms: Jnanam, Trikala Drishtir, Ashtasiddhi, Samadhir, iti Vijnana Chatushtayam. I'll take Ashtasiddhi first, because that's what comes next in the passage in Savitri, 2 of the 8 Siddhis. The 8 Siddhis are part of the Raja Yoga tradition. They don't actually occur in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, but they occur in commentaries on the Yoga Sutra, and there's a list which is not absolutely identical to Sri Aurobindo's, but almost the same. And Sri Aurobindo takes the terms and gives them his own interpretation. So we're going to look particularly at the first 2, Vyapti and Prakamyam. The 8 are Vyapti, Prakamyam, Aishwaryam, Ishita, Vashita, Mahima, Laghima, Anima. There are 3 groups actually: the siddhis of knowledge, the siddhis of power, and the siddhis of the body. They constitute the 8 siddhis. He explains that here. To take first the siddhis of knowledge, Sri Aurobindo explains, consciousness in one material being communicates with the same consciousness in another material being by certain fixed methods such as speech, gesture, writing, etc. But these limitations are mere habits. Consciousness in itself is free to communicate between one mind and another without physical means, consciously and voluntarily. The 2 siddhis by which this is done are called Vyapti and Prakamya. Vyapti Vyapti is when the thoughts, feelings, etc. of others or any kind of knowledge of things outside yourself are felt coming to the mind from those things or persons. This is the power of receptive vyapti. There is also a power of communicative vyapti, when you can send or put your own thought, feeling, etc. into someone else. We'll see all these things in Savitri in a moment. Prakamya is when you look mentally or physically at somebody or something and perceive what is in that person or thing, thoughts, feelings, facts about them, etc. So in Savitri we have these lines. The word perception is used. You just use the word perceive in defining prakamya, and also use the term to look into. When you look mentally or physically at somebody or something. A pure perception lent its lucent joy. Its intimate vision waited not to think. It enveloped all nature in a single glance. It looked into the very self of things. Deceived no more by form, he saw the soul. And then a little later we have vyapti. First, receptive vyapti. He felt the beating life in other men invade him with their happiness and their grief. Their love, their anger, their unspoken hopes entered in currents or in pouring waves into the immobile ocean of his calm. And then communicative vyapti. He heard the inspired sound of his own thoughts re-echoed in the vault of other minds. The world's thought streams traveled into his ken. Vyapti and prakamya are a major topic of the record of yoga. Together, variously defined in this particular passage, Sri Aurobindo translates vyapti as telepathy. Sometimes he takes vyapti and prakamya together as telepathy. But in any case, he did hundreds of experiments to confirm the possibility of telepathy, of thought reading, etc. And he writes here in one entry, there has long been a free and successful telepathy, vyapti, and reading, prakamya, of the characters, feelings, and states of mind of others, but the thought contents of the mind of others have been hidden from me except occasionally. Today, however, the veil was lifted, the barrier finally broken. Not only did telepathy and thought reading abound, but in a single day the proof of correctness began to be ample. Sri Aurobindo very often refers to his experiences as proving the validity and the working of these various siddhis which he was testing in his yoga. Now, let's go on to the next member of the Vijnana Chatushtaya. We'll come back to the first two, but let's go on to samadhi, which is defined in a somewhat unusual way in the record of yoga. Samadhi is the power to extend the range of knowledge and consciousness to the experience, either in reflected images or in the things themselves, of other worlds and planes of consciousness. As an example, because samadhi depends on the development of subtle senses in order to become aware of other worlds, as he says, in order to extend the range of knowledge and consciousness. Part of that is extending the range of the senses and using subtle senses rather than being confined to the gross physical senses of our ordinary consciousness. So here we have sukshma sparsha is increasing in force and keenness, touch. Sukshma gandha, taste, and gandha rasa, gandha of course, smell, and rasa, taste, with sparsha is keen and powerful, but irregular in occurrence. Shravana and drishti, hearing and vision, of actual forms and voices as opposed to images and symbolic sounds are still behindhand. All these are now recognized as parts of samadhi or vishwagati. Now, vishwagati is a very interesting term which he uses as equivalent to samadhi, especially if we think of the record of yoga in relation to Savitri, because the longest book of Savitri is the second book, the book of the Traveler of the Worlds, and Vishwagati is precisely the ability to travel through other worlds, to enter into other worlds. This is what he means by Vishwa. The whole universe opens itself up to us, and other universes beyond the physical. In Savitri, we find that the contact with hidden worlds is also associated with the development of all these different senses in this passage. The mind leaned out to meet the hidden worlds. So this is samadhi, as Sri Aurobindo defines it in the record. Air glowed and teemed with marvelous shapes and hues. In the nostrils quivered celestial fragrances. On the tongue lingered the honey of paradise. A channel of universal harmony. Hearing was a stream of magic audience. So we have all except sparsha, but that comes a couple pages later. Touch, a contact thrilled of mighty unknown things. Awakened to new unearthly closenesses, the touch replied to subtle infinities. And with a silver cry of opening gates, sight's lightnings leaped into the invisible. Now, we haven't talked yet about the first Chatushtaya, which is the Samatha Chatushtaya, also referred to sometimes as the Shakti Chatushtaya. The first two members are Samatha and Shakti. And this, of course, is extremely important in Sri Aurobindo's yoga. It comes in specifically into the yoga of the king a few pages after the passages we were just reading. But we also have a quite precise description of what he calls passive samatha. He defines samatha in this way. The basis of internal peace is samatha, the capacity of receiving with a calm and equal mind all the attacks and appearances of outward things. There are two forms of samatha, passive and active. Samatha in reception of the things of the outward world, and samatha in reaction to them. Passive samatha consists of three things: titiksha, udasinata, natihi, iti samatha. Titiksha is the bearing firmly of all contacts, pleasant or unpleasant, not being overpowered by that which is painful, not being carried away by that which is pleasant. Calmly and firmly to receive both and hold and bear them as one who is stronger, greater, vaster than any attack of the world is the attitude of titiksha. Udasinata is indifference to the dvandvas or dualities. It means literally being seated above, superior to all physical and mental touches. Nati is the submission of the soul to the will of God, its acceptance of all touches as his touches, of all experience as his play with the soul of man. Now, the account of equality or samatha in the yoga of the king begins with udasinata in the literal sense of being seated above. His heights of being lived in the still self. His mind could rest on a supernal ground and look down on the magic and the play. To the still heights and to the troubled depths, his equal spirit gave its vast ascent. One could say that this vast ascent is nati, the acceptance of all contacts as the divine will. Then we have specifically titiksha and udasinata, a poised serenity of tranquil strength, a wide, unshaken look on time's unrest, faced all experience with an altered peace. This is titiksha, endurance, what Sri Aurobindo explains elsewhere as the stoic equality that depends on the strength of the will, whereas udasinata is the philosophical equality of indifference, of being seated above, and indifferent to the dvandvas, the dualities, indifferent to the sorrow and delight, untempted by the marvel and the call, immobile, it beheld the flux of things. And now to come briefly back to Jnanam, the first member of the Vijnana Chatushtaya. By jnana is meant that power of direct and divine knowledge which works independently of the intellect and senses, or uses them only as subordinate assistants. Just to take one example from several pages in Savitri, beginning with oft inspiration with her lightning feet, etc. Here we have two of the powers of this intuitive or inspired knowledge of jnana. An inspired knowledge sat enthroned within, whose seconds illumined more than reason's years. An ictus of revealing luster fell as if a pointing accent upon truth, and like a sky flare showing all the ground, a swift intuitive discernment shone. Now we come to the Brahma Chatushtaya, which consists of Sarvam Anantam Jnanam Anandam Brahma. Sri Aurobindo explains Sarvam Brahma as when we realize one thing in the universe, Anantam when we realize infinite force and quality at play in all forms, Jnanam Brahma when we realize a consciousness in everything which is aware of all, and Anandam Brahma when we realize in that consciousness a delight in all things. All four of these are described in a passage in Savitri, which we'll come to. But first, let me read this passage in an entry in the record of yoga. It is seen that the Sarvam Brahma is prominent when the tapas of mental chaitanya is fixed on matter. Sarvam Anantam is felt when the tapas is fixed on matter and life. Sarvam Anantam Jnanam when the tapas is fixed on life, matter and mind. But when the jnanam increases and is sun-illumined, then the anandam also appears, and the Saguna Brahman becomes the Leelamaya Parapurusha. So here we have first Jnanam Brahma, the description of the physical world changing its nature from that of an immense machine or mechanism to that of the living body of God. The universe was not now this senseless world borne round inert on an immense machine. It cast away its grandiose, lifeless front, a mechanism no more or work of chance, but a living movement of the body of God. Life kept no more a dull and meaningless shape. In the struggle and upheaval of the world, he saw the labor of a Godhead's birth. A secret knowledge masked as ignorance, fate covered with an unseen necessity, the game of chance of an omnipotent will. A glory and a rapture and a charm, the all-blissful sat unknown within the heart. Earth's pains were the ransom of its prisoned delight. So here, just to show the correlation between Sarvam Brahma and the perception of the world as the living body, the physical world as the living body of God, then Anantam, which is felt when the concentration is on life, the play of forces, life kept no more a dull and meaningless shape, etc. And then when the concentration shifts to mind, Jnanam Brahma appears, a secret knowledge masked as ignorance. And finally, A glory and a rapture and a charm, the all-blissful sat unknown within the heart. Earth's mains were the ransom of its risen delight. This is the Ananda Brahma, or Ananda Brahman. At the bottom of the same page, we're getting close to the end of this canto. We have a reference to the beginning of the transformation of the body, which is the subject of the fourth Chatushtaya, the Sharira Chatushtaya. Even his body's subtle self within could raise the earthly parts towards higher things and feel on it the breath of heavenlier air. Already it journeyed towards divinity. Upbuoyed upon winged winds of rapid joy, upheld to a light it could not always hold, it left mind's distance from the truth supreme and lost life's incapacity for bliss. Here we have a couple of aspects of the Sharira Chatushtaya. Lost life's incapacity for bliss at the end suggests the final member of the Sharira Chatushtaya, Ananda. Arogya, Uttapana, Saundarya, and Ananda are the four terms in the Sharira Chatushtaya, but it's especially Uttapana, which ultimately means levitation, but means, as Sri Aurobindo explains, the state of not being subject to the pressure of physical forces. We had upbuoyed, upheld, words like that in this passage. In Savitri, there are three stages: when there's great force, lightness, strength in the body, when there's no physical weariness, when one is not necessarily subject to the law of gravitation. All of these things are things that Sri Aurobindo experienced and was working on during the period of the record of yoga. Now we come to the last term in the Vijnana Chatushtaya that I haven't talked about, Trikaldrishti, the vision of the three times, namely past, present, and future. Time's secrets were to him an oft-read book. The records of the future and the past outline their excerpts on the etheric page. I won't go into the details of this last line about the etheric page, the Akasha Lipi, etc. But the records of the future and the past are the past, particularly the future. The records of the future were of great interest to Sri Aurobindo. He explains Trikaldrishti as a special faculty of jnana by which that general power is applied to the actuality of things, their details of event, tendency, etc., in the past, present, and future of the world as it exists, has existed, and will exist in time. It deals with particular fact just as jnana deals with general truth. A particularly interesting entry on that subject in the record of yoga doesn't actually mention Trikaldrishti, but it refers to the perception, static versus the dynamic perception of event. There is a struggle between static perception of event and dynamic perception of event, passive and active chit. The latter, which alters the event predestined by the ensemble of forces by a personal intervention, i.e. of higher forces, is becoming rapidly stronger. This is of special interest in relation to Savitri because in the story of Savitri, basically Narad gives the static perception of event, and Savitri, the dynamic perception of event, which changes the event. It alters the event predestined by the ensemble of forces which had been predicted quite accurately on a certain plane of consciousness by Narad. But Narad himself, of course, says towards the end, what else shall be is written in her soul. And so he leaves it to Savitri to see whether it's possible to change fate. Now, finally, we come to the power three Siddhis of the Ashtasiddhi that constitute what Sri Aurobindo called power. Apart he lived, in his mind's solitude, a demigod shaping the lives of men. One soul's ambition lifted up the race. A power worked, but none knew whence it came. Sri Aurobindo explains the Siddhis of power by saying there is a power in the consciousness of acting upon other conscious beings or even upon things without physical means or persuasion or compulsion. The three powers are Aishwarya, Ishita, Vashita. These powers can only be entirely acquired or safely used when we have got rid of egoism and identified ourselves with the infinite will and the infinite consciousness. We needn't go into the details of the difference between these three, Vashita, Aishwarya, and Ishita. Very often Sri Aurobindo refers to the three collectively in any case as simply power. Power works in preparing the subjective state of others in the world, steadily but slowly and against a dull and heavy resistance. In objective result, it is as yet poor and uncertain except in isolated details. This was in 1912. The power, of course, increased in effectivity later on. Sometimes also he used the word Aishwarya to stand for the three together, Aishwarya Traya. Aishwarya increases considerably and rapidly in force and effectiveness, no longer in the old field of exercise mainly, movements of birds, beasts, insects, people around. Unfortunately, I haven't had time to give examples of all these experiments that Sri Aurobindo is doing, which he refers to here as conducted in the field of exercise. Not only there, but in the wider range of life. In the outside world, events in the Balkans, this is a year before the outbreak of the First World War, events in the Balkans show a considerable increase in the particular effectiveness. And then he makes a similar statement here. He refers to the field of experiment rather than the field of experiment rather than the field of exercise, and contrasts it with the karma of life, because the field of experiment is the field of his immediate environment in which he developed the Siddhis. But the karma of life belongs properly not to the third Chatushtaya, the Vijnana Chatushtaya, but the fifth Chatushtaya, which is called the Karma Chatushtaya. And I won't go into the details about the Karma Chatushtaya, but two key terms in relation to karma are swarat and samrat. And we have this sentence on an interesting date, 15th of August 1914, the date on which the publication of the Arya began on Sri Aurobindo's birthday. And Sri Aurobindo received a kind of message from the master of the yoga: become master in the karma, samrat as well as swarat. In Savitri we have both Swarajya and Samrajya referred to. His inner self grew near to others' selves and bore a kinship's weight, a common tie, yet stood untouched, king of itself alone. King of itself is a literal translation of Swarat. Samrajya, properly speaking, comes only at the end of Ashwapati's yoga, and in fact at the end of the whole first part of Savitri, on the last page of Book 3. He raised his brow of conquest to the heavens, establishing the empire of the soul on matter and its bounded universe, as on a solid rock in infinite seas. So the empire of the soul on matter and its bounded universe, this is Samrajya. With regard to Swarajya and Samrajya, I'm almost finished now. It's about time to have our tea break, but there's just one more letter, and or entry in two more entries in the record of yoga, which I would like to conclude with. Sri Aurobindo writes at one point, "It is not yet clearly fixed for the intellect that the master of the yoga is the master of the world, but it is fixed for the faith." We haven't talked about faith, but faith, in fact, is an important part of the Shakti Chatushtaya. And this is clear that it is the swarat of the system, accepting the conditions he has created for the work of development, and not at once manifesting his full power and knowledge. Obviously, Swarajya is much easier than Samrajya. To become the master of one's own internal system is much easier than to become master of the world. But he concludes this entry, "It had already been indicated that this was his method, a progressive unveiling out of the satyam and anritam of the human creature, the truth and falsehood of the human creature. The same rule would then apply to him as master of the world, Samrat, but there the mastery is not yet so wide and absolute. The evolution has not proceeded so far and is therefore not so evident." And in fact, the Karma Chatushtaya is one of the parts of the Sapta Chatushtaya that remained in an unsatisfactory state because of the difficulty of transforming the world during the whole period of the record of yoga and even afterwards. But I'll conclude with just this short but extremely interesting entry on November 13th, 1913, under the heading Amrita, because this brings out the difference between the record of yoga and Savitri. A clear distinction must now be made between the Vidya Avidya Siddhi, which is constituted by the 7 Chatushtayas, the Siddhi of the knowledge ignorance, what he later defined as the overmind Siddhi, which is constituted by the 7 Chatushtayas, and the higher Amrita, in which all limitation is removed and death, etc., entirely cease. Only the first will in this life be entirely accomplished. So in this prophetic insight, we get a glimpse of how Savitri takes up where the record of yoga leaves off. Savitri includes the Siddhi of the 7 Chatushtayas, but ultimately it goes beyond it to the higher Amrita symbolized by Savitri's victory over death. And so at that point, Sri Aurobindo stopped keeping the diary, and after 1927, until the end of his life, more and more focused his efforts on Savitri, which represents, whereas you might say that the Sapta Chatushtaya and the yoga of Sri Aurobindo's yoga up to the Siddhi of November 1926 represents the possibilities of the present world, but Savitri is a prophecy of the future and represents the removal of all limitations, the higher Amrita, and that is what is symbolized through Savitri's victory over death. So in the end, Savitri goes beyond the record of yoga, but it includes a quite detailed account of Sri Aurobindo's experiences during the period when he was practicing the yoga of self-perfection according to the record, according to the Sapta Chatushtaya as recorded in the record of yoga. So with that, I'll conclude.